So last time we saw this multimodal logic, which is epistemic logic, and there the multiple modalities were interpreted as different knowers or agents, and we talked about uh, iterating the modalities as using A knows that B knows, etc. Right. So the important thing there was all the modalities are independent, right? The accessibility relations are all independent. Now, when you have a multimodal logic where one is related to the other, for instance, we're talking about two modalities, one like we look at, uh, which is a transitive closure of the other, or one is a complement of the other, one is a reverse of the other, we get particular kind of logics. So today I want to talk about modal logic of transitive closure, and this is of great interest in logics of computation. So that is the connection for that. See if I can- Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So logics of computation. That is the topic really. See, as we talked about, modal logics describe transition systems, right? I mean, that's how we started. The frames are just graphs or transition systems, states and transitions, and they characterize by simulation. And by simulation is the way to think about transition systems. Now, however, typically we are not interested only in transitions. We don't want to just say that system is in some state and you have a transition to a new state. We also want to look at reachability, right? We want to say that by a sequence of transitions, you get to something, right? So this is how, I mean, so automata are transition systems with some, for instance, your acceptance conditions for finite state automata talk about reachability, right? You want to say this particular state is reached using a path. NFAs are basically talking about reaching final states from initial states, right? Some set of states I and some set of states F. So, and we often are also interested in states that are visited infinitely often, right? That basically that means you are in a loop. You want to find out if you're in a loop, you're stuck in a loop, or you want to say that every time I get into a loop, I can always exit a loop, right? Things like that. And this is really the way you reason about transition systems, programs, whatever. Now, all this requires transitive closure, which we know is inexpressible in first order logic, right? So if you want to talk about anything like reachability, you want to talk about something that you visit infinitely often, you want transitive closure. And we've already seen that first order logic is not expressive enough to talk about transitive closure. So, but then modal logic itself is sitting inside first order logic, right? I think that should be clear that whatever we have been talking about is first order. So transitive closure is going to take you farther than first order. Now, ML modal logic semantics itself is definable in first order logic. How do you do that? Well, you can give a translation from modal logic into first order logic. We talked about this earlier. We just go over that. If you if you're talking about modal logic, propositional modal logic, you have a bunch of atomic propositions, and then you close under negation, disjunction, and modality. Now, what you do is consider the first order language, right? Okay, so I hope you understand what I'm talking about. I want to translate propositional modal logic into first order logic. How do you do that? Now, you take a proposition in modal logic. That proposition is true or false at different worlds, right? In some worlds it's true, some worlds it's false. Now, one way of thinking about in first order logic that corresponds to a unary predicate, right? If you were to think of the frame as a domain, right? The set of worlds that you're talking about as elements of the domain, your proposition is true at certain worlds and false at certain worlds. So every atomic proposition P corresponds to a unary predicate QP, right? QP of X, like QP of X says that X is the proposition P is true at the element X. The element is actually the world. Right? So you can turn this frame into a first order structure, which is a bunch of words and a binary relation on it. Right? That's exactly your frame, right? A set of words and a binary relation on it. So that's your domain. One moment. So the translation should be clear. The proposition P is translated into a unary predicate, like I said, QP, but you need a variable, right? So that's why the translation tags the variable along with it. So this is a translation tau, which takes modal logic formulas and translates them into first order logic formulas with one free variable, right? And that free variable I'm going to use is X, right? So the atomic proposition gets translated into QPFX. Negation alpha, just, negation of the translated formula. The tau X of the disjunction is the disjunction of the translated formulas. What about diamond alpha? It says that, this is exactly the semantics, right? There exists another world W prime such that if you are alpha, if you have the current world X is related to Y and tau Y of alpha holds now. Now you translate the formula alpha with respect to the variable Y. Right? Note that in this whole formula, only X is free, right? So you're always translating a given modal formula into a first order formula with one free variable. Now look at a modal model. Modal model doesn't sound funny, but yeah. And it's also a first order model with the valuation providing the interpretation for the unary predicates, which is how it should be after all, right? Thus we can see in modal logic, the formula alpha holds at W if and only if you take the same model, right? Because the domain is the set of worlds and the binary relation R is the interpretation of R here. And this formula with one free variable is true at W, right? We have this notation already, right? In first order logic, if you take any formula, you look at the sequence of free variables and you put the sequence on the left hand side. There is only one here, and so the element here. So you can read this exactly equivalently. And now you can do induction carefully and see. Okay? So any formula alpha, you are now translating it into tau X of alpha. Now, when you go over to something of the form diamond beta, right, the translation of that will give you with Y. But now the free variable Y is what you will interpret appropriately. Now, you have to do it systematically and check that the whole thing goes through. Yeah. So basically, this is to say that modal logic sits inside a fragment of first order logic. What kind of first order logic is it? It's got only monadic predicates. It's got one binary relation, lots of predicates, and that's it, right? The vocabulary doesn't have any, there's no function symbols, there are no constants. So it's only the relational vocabulary, relational, which should be out there, the relational vocabulary with this, right? And you can translate it into that. But we know that this logic, we know about relational vocabulary. As I said, transitive closure is not expressible in this. Now we've already seen that modal logics, modal formulas preserve by simulation, right? One of the things we showed that was that if I take two models that are bisimilar, they satisfy the same formula. Now it's very easy to find FO formulas that do not preserve by simulation. Can you think of what kind of formula they'll be? Even with the vocabulary restriction that we have got. Any ideas? What would be examples of two structures that are not bisimilar? That are, okay, that bisimulation, yeah, no, this is the correct thing. Yeah, first order formulas that do not preserve bisimulation. That means what? There are two bisimilar structures, right? And in, of course, their modal logic cannot distinguish them. First order formula that will distinguish them. Okay. Suppose, okay, I should have pictures that are paying with this. Yeah. Maybe I can try still. Okay. It's horrible, but let me. Okay. So, as usual. I forgot to know what, which I use. Maybe this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let me say P and okay. I mean, surely these two frames are these two models are bisimilar, right? Because I can equate these two and both of these will map to the state here. Yeah. So of course they are bisimilar. But can we think of, and of course in modal logic, I can say box not P or diamond not P, it doesn't matter. They're both satisfied here. P and box not P, P and diamond not P, whatever. Right? What about first order logic? In first order logic, I claim that you can distinguish. Yeah. Here I will say there exists X, there exists Y, X not equal to Y, and whatever is the proposition that you have attached here. Yeah. Not QP X and not QPY. Yeah. I can count, right? I can say there are two distinct successors, both satisfying not P. That's true here, but it's not true here, right? Yeah. Let's call this X, right? QP of X holds, and here I will have QP of X, and there exists Y, RXY, and there exists Z, RXZ, and not QP of Y and not QP of Z. You can't do that here, right? So first order logic actually can is it clear? You can count. You can count, you can make copies and count the number of copies in first order logic, which you cannot do in modal logic, right? So first order formulas need not respect bisimulation. Yeah? So two structures that are bisimilar need not satisfy the same F4 formulas. So basically this is to show that ML is a strictly smaller fragment of first order logic. And can we characterize this fragment? Can we say which fragment it is? And yes, indeed, you can. There's a very nice theorem due to Johann van Bentham in 1976, which says that if I start with the first order formula, which happens to be bisimulation invariant, what does that mean? Consider those formulas that do respect bisimulation, then it's actually equivalent to a modal one. So that means modal logic is not just a fragment of first order logic. It's not just bisimulation invariant. It's exactly the bisimulation invariant fragment of first order logic. So, and this is a theorem we can prove. Not very difficult. And if we had another lecture, I could prove it, but I think we have other things to do, so I'm not taking it up. It's just, you know, you can use EF games, you can use this idea of bisimulation, you can, you know, like we talked about, like M equivalence, you can talk about M bisimulation, bisimilar up to depth M, and use that to go down. So not a difficult argument, but a nice, very nice argument. And but I'm skipping the proof here. Okay, so this is exactly what it is. But now, as I said, today we are going to talk about transitive closure. We go beyond FO, but it turns out that the logic that we define, we will see, and you'll be able to see yourself that it continues to respect bisimulation. And can we then characterize this logic also as a fragment of, well, must be some second order logic, right? In fact, and yes, in fact, it is the bisimulation invariant fragment of what is called weak chain logic. We have already seen monadic second order logic. If you take monadic second order logic, we had only quantification over sets, right? If you have quantification over arbitrary sets, but instead, if you have quantification over finite parts, you get what is called weak chain logic. If you allow quantification over arbitrary parts, you get chain logic. And in fact, we can show that the logic that I'm talking about is in fact the bisimulation invariant logic fragment of weak chain logic. That's a difficult theorem. Okay, I wouldn't even attempt to prove in this course, but this is to say that what we are, whenever you're talking about modal logics of some kind, modal logics in general live within first order logic, but when you go into multimodal logics with relationships, it need not necessarily, the translation that we looked at need not necessarily hold. And so you have to be careful about what we are asserting. For example, the multi-agent epistemic logic that I talked about last time is in fact embedded in the first order logic with n equivalence relations. And so you can take first order logic with n equivalence relations, and that multi-agent epistemic logic is actually sitting there. And in fact, it is in fact the bisimulation invariant fragment of the FO with n equivalence relations. By the way, we should be careful about all these translations and things, because first order logic is in general undecidable. Remember, first order logic with even one binary relation is undecidable, right? We have seen that. I hope you remember that. I mean, this is Gödel's theorem. So, and whereas first order modal logic is sitting inside that, but it's decidable. Similarly, if I take first order logic and extend with n equivalence relations, more than two equivalence relations, it's undecidable. Whereas multi-agent epistemic logic that we talked about is in fact decidable, as we saw last time. So it's it's sitting inside. So what is very interesting is that by putting a condition like bisimulation invariance in first order logic, you identify a decidable fragment, right? You start with an undecidable logic and you put something like bisimulation invariance. Why should that give you decidability, right? So it's not clear at all. But by showing that it's equivalent to modal logic, you're able to see that that fragment of first order logic is actually decidable. Okay, these are all side remarks. We'll actually now get to logic of transitive closure. What is that? It's the logic that you would expect. Bimodal logic. There are two modalities. One I have kept for next alpha. You read it as next alpha. And so O alpha, you read it as there is a successor state where alpha holds. And diamond alpha, you read as there is a reachable state where alpha holds. So clearly this is the idea that this is the one-step relation. And the second one is about the reflexive transitive closure of the first relation. So you're talking about paths over the first part. And you need duals of these. O dot alpha is not O not alpha, is every successive state alpha holds. The dual of diamond is box, which you read as every reachable state alpha holds. So it's the same modality. Now the diamond and box are reserved for the one that is reflexive and transitive, and the one step is used using O. Now, why do you do that? I typically also, since we are used to diamond alpha as one step, I write diamond and put diamond star here for to say it's the reflexive transitive closure. But then it's not standard notation, and this is the standard notation. So if you look in the literature, this is the sort of thing that's used. So I would leave it at that. So is the syntax clear? Any questions? This is fairly straightforward, but yeah, I mean, am I saying something bizarre? I mean, it just, instead of writing diamond 1 and diamond 2, right, two modalities, I've written O and diamond, that's all. Yeah. And I hope it's okay. Can I move on? Okay. What about the semantics? It's the alpha holds in the world W, at W in the model M, as usual. Everything is as before. And this is exactly what we have been talking about as a modality. O alpha holds if and only if there is a accessible world where alpha holds. Diamond alpha says if there is a world that W prime belongs to R star. What is R star? The reflexive transitive closure of R. Right? This is the same as saying there is a path from W to W prime, right? Where reflexive is also included, where alpha holds. Okay? This is exactly so this is the same as saying it's a modal logic with R1 and R2, where R2 is R1 star. Right? That's how you read this. And as one would expect, formula alpha is satisfiable if there exists a model and some world W in it where alpha holds. And alpha is defined to be valid if and only if its negation is not satisfied. So, as I said, semantics is fairly obvious. And the only reason we are now talking about something which is not any longer in first order logic is because this R star is sitting here. And as I said, reflexive transitive closure is something that you cannot define in first order logic. So you know that you're embedding it into some extension of first order logic or second order logic. Any questions on this? Okay, so this is the logic. So syntax, semantics, everything is defined. So what's the question that you ask? What's the first question that you study in a new logic that you propose? Any new logic?
Given any formula and a model.
Yes. I'm not asking you to answer me, but I'm asking you to tell me what is the question. Yeah. The moment you define a logic, it's semantics. What is the kind of algorithmic question? I can't hear. Something is being said by somebody.
If a given formula is satisfiable in a given model.
Is it satisfiable? Okay. That's usually a harder question. What's a simpler question? Truth checking, right? Given a finite model M, you want to know at a W is alpha true at W, right? And this is a very simple algorithm, right? You have a finite model, a formula, and you want to check if it is true. Right? And we have a labeling algorithm. What is the labeling algorithm? Once again, to remind you, there are only finitely many words. Think of them as rows, right? W1 to WK. And write the formulas as columns in ascending order. By ascending order, I mean using subformulas. The least ones will be propositions, and then negations of formulas, disjunctions, conjunctions, whatever you have, and then modalities. Right? In general, the idea is that how does the labeling algorithm go? The propositions are already valuation is filled out for you for all the words. So first few columns are filled. So by the time you look at a formula and a word, you already know that for all the words, all the subformulas have already been decided, right? When I want to look at the column for not beta, the column for beta is already there. So you take that column and do one's complement. When I look at beta 1 or beta 2, the column for beta 1 is there, the column for beta 2 is there. You just take the two columns and do bitwise OR and put it in. This is how we do it, right, for model logic. And for O alpha now, right? Well, for any world W, I want to check if O alpha is true. Well, that's why if you have pre-computed the successors of W, right? And that's easy. For W, you can keep an index, right? There are K worlds, so there is a K bit vector. So for the successors of W, that's another K bit vector, right? Immediately you go there and then you see if any one of them has for the column for alpha has one, then you know that next alpha holds. Same thing for the reachability set, right? Now, this is just a graph, right? For any world, there is a K node graph. You want to ask which are all the ones that are accessible. That's again among the K bit vector. You want to find out which are all reachable and mark them. You can pre-compute that, and it's all polynomial time, right? Independent of the formula, you look at the graph, pre-compute the successor relation, pre-compute the, what do you call it, reachability set for every world, every node, and you can do that. So for every one of the K vertices, you just write the K bit vector along with that. And as I said, that's eminently doable in polynomial time. And so once you have that, algorithm goes through like a tree. So basically you have an algorithm that's polynomial in the size of the model and linear in the size of the formula. So I've told you these things that long ago, that you have to understand these things, and by now you should just be able to do it all yourselves. Right? And yeah, so it's a pretty straightforward thing. What about satisfiability, like Ananya asked? That is the next question. Now, given a formula, you want to know whether it's satisfied. Now, the filtration technique that I talked about last time can be used. In fact, goes exactly the same way like I did. What's the filtration technique? You're given a formula alpha to be decided. Look at the subformulas of alpha. Given any model, define an equivalence relation on the worlds. You say two worlds are equated if they satisfy the same subformulas, right? That's an equivalence relation. Quotient the given model with respect to that, right? And now you will have very similar kind of arguments that we talked about. So then, and then you say that between two equivalence classes, I relate them. If there exists one here, there exists one there, such that in the old model they were related, right? Now, same problem that I talked about comes for paths. Well, there is one edge relation here, one edge relation here, one edge relation. Somehow you have to find a path. If there is a path in the original model, I have to find a path in the new model. It's a little bit of a trick that it's exactly the same sort of thing that we did for transfer. Goes through, and you can show that if alpha is satisfiable, then it is satisfiable in a model, because the index of the equivalence relation is, right, the equivalence number of equivalence classes is bounded by the number of subsets of subformulas you can have. Therefore, it's exponential in size. And from this, you get a non-deterministic exponential time procedure, which can be actually improved to deterministic exponential time. And but then I'm not going to do this. This is to say that whatever techniques you have got works pretty much the same way. But we will see. Oh, it's a typo there. Prat showed that, in fact, last time I said that you can do filtration and you can actually improve it to p-space. But that's not possible here. Prat showed that, in fact, DXP time is a lower bound. Now, it's worth thinking about why suddenly, so far, we have been talking about p-space. Suddenly now it is exponential time. So what's the argument for that? Now, if we looked at if you remember in modal logic, right? How did we prove decidability? We said if you give me a formula alpha, if it's satisfiable, it is satisfiable in a tree model. You remember that? And then we showed that it's not only satisfied in a tree model, but in a tree model whose depth is linear in the size of the formula. That's what I called a shallow tree, right? The branching degree is again linear in the size of alpha. But now with the logic of transitive closure, we can show that still, if we still have the theorem that if alpha is satisfiable, it's satisfiable in a tree model, but we can now force the height of the tree to be not something linear, but in fact exponential. And so that means that you have tree models, but the tree models are no longer shallow. The tree is pretty big, right? Pretty deep. And that's the heart of of course, that in itself doesn't prove that it's the satisfiability is lower bound is dxp time. But once you understand it, it's very easy to actually. Now, how do you show this? It's not very difficult. The idea is very simple. Suppose you have n Boolean variables, from P1 to Pn, right? Now, I can always say in modal logic, wherever I am, right, after each successor, exactly one variable flips. How will you say this? Let's say P1 to Pn, right? Let's say P1, P or Q. You have two. How will you say? You will say, I mean, P and Q implies after, there is a next step where not P and Q holds. There is the next step after P and not Q holds, right? You don't want both variables to change. That's all. This is what you want to say. And you want to say this anywhere that I can reach in the tree, right? Whatever be the variables that you have got, exactly one variable changes, right? Or over I, right? Pi implies O, not Pi. Not Pi implies OPI. And over I not equal to J, Pi implies OP, Pj implies OPJ, not Pj implies O not Pj, right? So this is a way to ensure that exactly one variable flips. And then I can always write the initial configurations, let's say, is not P1 to not Pn, right? Stands for zeros, right? And I say diamond, right? Now, diamond says eventually not P1 to not Pn, the conjunction. Whatever is the initial configuration that you started with, I'll say the same initial configuration is reachable. Now, you can actually check that there exists a path of exponential length because this is the n-bit counter. Like, what's the n-bit counter? It will start with 0, 0, 0, 0. One variable flips, then one variable flips. You keep doing, and eventually you come back to 0, 0, 0, 0. Right? Now, of course, this is not, when I say exactly one variable, you have to schedule it in such a way that it's not, it doesn't go as 0, 1, 0, 1, right? You have to make all of them flip. But that's not very difficult. Right? The main point is that once you have one modality that takes care of a transition, another one which takes care of reachability, it's not very difficult to program an n-bit counter along a path. This is fairly interesting to actually sit and do. And you can have another Boolean variable to manage the levels for you. And you can actually code. This is a very nice one to show that, you know, there are formulas, right, such that any model for the formula will have path length which is exponential in the size of the formula. So this tells you that, I mean, this already suggests that you're not going to get a p-space lower bound, right? P-space upper bound. So the lower bound is going to be something worse, right? There is no shallow tree, but if you're going to start writing down information for you, you have to write out some exponential amount of information. So, and it turns out that, in fact, you can actually, it's the logic is dxp time complete. I'm saying all this because we have seen propositional logic, which is really NP complete, modal logic, which is p-space complete, and the logic of transitive closure that we are looking at today, that's actually exponential time complete. So I told you that logics and complexity classes have very nice parallels. And for if you want to think about XP time completeness, in some sense, transitive closure logic is the logic to think about. And it turns out that, if you want 2 XP time, 2 to the 2 to the n, I'll give you one logic for that. In fact, that's a complete logic for that. It's a very nice logic. So, and this relation between complexity of logical theories, and this is, fundamental to the whole business. And it's not surprising that Cook came up with the theory of entry completeness by thinking about Boolean logic. Okay, so these things have very, very nice parallels. I don't have the space in this course to look at too much connection between logic and complexity. Anyway, you will do a course in complexity theory next semester, and after which you come back to logic and look at the connections, you will understand this much better. So that's why we are not looking at lower bounds at all, but it's actually something very nice. And transitive closure is a very, very good way to think about exponential time. Okay, now what about validities, valid formulas? All modal validities continue to hold for whatever O and its dual O dot, right? And that's very reasonable because that's exactly what are the modalities that we are using now. But in addition, we have some more things. What is that? Somehow we want to relate the O modality and the diamond modality, or O dot, with the box modality, the transitive closure. So for instance, we have this, right? If box alpha holds, what does box alpha say? I'm here in all the reachable worlds, alpha holds, right? Well, it's reflexive, therefore, in particular, alpha holds right now, right? Remember, we have taken the reflexive transitive closure, right? So the R star is reflexive. So if box alpha implies alpha, we know that in any. And then, if in all reachable worlds it holds, therefore it holds in every successor as well, right? So this should be easy, right? Box alpha implies alpha, and box alpha in fact implies O dot alpha. O dot alpha stands for every successor state satisfies alpha. Is it clear that these are valid? Any question? Okay. In fact, we can strengthen this to say if box alpha holds now, after any successor state, again box alpha will hold, right? Because whatever is reachable from a successor state is reachable from here, right? Do you understand this? Right? I'm a W, and then I take a step, I see W prime. Now, whatever is reachable from W prime is reachable from W as well. So if box alpha already held, then after one step again box alpha holds, right? So box alpha implies after every successor step, box alpha holds. And so now I can strengthen this together. And then something very interesting happens. The converse is also true. What is this? Suppose alpha holds now, and after every, sorry? Yes,
So
Ananya?
what is the difference between box and diamond here?
Oh, box is in all reachable worlds. Diamond says there is a reachable world. Right. I'm sitting in a graph. Diamond alpha will say there is a path to a node where alpha holds. Box alpha says all the reachable worlds from reachable states, whatever, from this node satisfy alpha. Yeah. So this is the standard duality between box and diamond that we've always had. What about O and O dot? O says there is a successor where alpha holds. O dot says every successor alpha holds. Is it clear? And that's the reason why the converse now holds. What does the converse say? If alpha holds now, and after every step, I see that in all the reachable worlds from there, alpha holds, then in all the reachable worlds, alpha holds now. Because suppose not, right? There is a reachable world where alpha holds, but then I must take one step, right? Because alpha actually holds already here. So if I have to find negation of alpha, I must take one step. But then after every step, I'm going to see in all the reachable words box alpha. How will I ever see diamond, the negation of alpha, right? So this is just the meaning of reachability. What is the meaning of reachability? I'm at W. W prime is reachable if I'm already at W prime, W equals W prime, or I take one step. right? At that step, it is W prime, or it's reachable from my one step. That's all that it says, right? So you read this as it's dual. What will it say? Diamond alpha implies either alpha now, or there is a next step after which diamond alpha holds. Yeah. So alpha is reachable from here if I'm already there, or after one step, it is in fact reachable. So, so if thus the fixed point equation, right? The fixed point equation says box alpha holds if and only if alpha and after every successor state box alpha holds. Why is it a fixed point equation? Because the right hand side is in terms of the left hand side, right? But of course, there is an exit clause as well. So, so this completely describes the semantics. And in fact, Segeberg in 1971 conjectured that adding this axiom would in fact give completeness for transfer closure logic. I mean, he was talking in a slightly different context, but this is the basically what Segeberg conjectured. Because this fixed point equation almost completely describes what reachability means to us, right? And as it turned out, it was not correct. And in fact, Segeberg tried to prove completeness for quite some time, and did not succeed because this is not good enough. And it took some time. And the axiomatization for this logic was given by Cozen and Parikh in 1980. And it's a very simple and very nice axiom system. What are the axioms? What you would expect. The substitutional instances of tautologies of propositional logic. That's what you begin with. And remember, for modal logic, we had this Kripke axiom, which you have now again. Box of alpha implies beta implies box alpha implies box beta. Same thing, that because you now have two modalities for both of them, you have this is at every next step alpha implies beta implies if at every next step alpha holds, then at, these are all like exactly standard modal logic that we have seen. And this is what I wrote just now. It turns out that you don't need the equivalence. You can always derive the other one. So I've just put in the forward one, which says a box alpha holds. And then remember the inference rules. We have modus ponens and modal generalization. If alpha is valid, then so is box alpha. We have an additional inference rule, and this is the rule of induction. Okay. What is mathematical induction? Mathematical induction says if a property holds for 0, and whenever it holds for n, it holds for n plus 1. Think of it as successive. Anytime it holds for now, if it also holds for the successor, then it holds for all of them. That's what it says here. If whenever alpha holds, it also holds for the successor state, right? If alpha implies that every successor state alpha is true, then whenever alpha is true, it's true for every reachable state. And this is called the analog of principle of induction. And with this induction, now they could show that the transfer closure logic is actually complete. And clearly the axiom system is sound. Okay, the soundness of these is just the standard modal logic. And this one is what we just saw. What about the induction principle? Why is it sound? Well, assume that this is valid. Alpha implies O dot alpha is valid. Means what? It's true in all models at all worlds. Now, assume that this is not valid. If it's not valid, what does it mean? There is a model, there is a world where this is false. That means in that place, alpha holds, but box alpha doesn't hold. That means there is a reachable state where negation alpha holds, right? Look at that path. Initially alpha holds, but by this validity, after one step alpha holds, right? But again, by this validity, after two steps alpha holds. Again, apply, keep doing. We saw a path leading to not alpha, but then that path, let's say it's of length n. Now after n steps, this will say alpha holds. So you will reach a world where both alpha holds and negation alpha holds. That's not possible. So this is again, this is exactly how, I mean, why the principle of induction is sound over arithmetic, right? This is very similar. Now, another way of thinking about alpha, you can think of alpha as a loop invariant, right? If this is exactly how we reason about loops, right? Take any, what is an invariant? Well, if it holds before the loop and it holds after one execution of the loop, it remains invariant. Then no matter how many times you execute the loop, the formula alpha. Right? This is how we reason about uh, iterations and loops and programs, right? So this is exactly what is going on. And then you see that it's fairly natural to happen. And so any question about induction? Any question about these rules? Is it clear? Okay. Okay. So now we are going to get into the completeness proof. And what I'm going to do is an argument which is a completeness cum decidability proof. So in one shot, you actually show that the axis system is complete, as well as you get a decision procedure for the logic. And it's quite nice. Yeah. So this is really prove one, get one free. I mean, right? So there are two theorems for the price of one. How do you do this? Well, you show that, how do you prove completeness? You show that every consistent formula is satisfiable. How do you show decidability? You show every satisfiable formula is satisfiable in a model of bounded size. So you combine the two, you show that every consistent formula is actually satisfiable in a model of bounded size. And this proves completeness because you have shown that every consistent formula has a model. In addition, it also shows that the logic has the bounded model property. Why? Soundness says every satisfiable formula is consistent. Completeness is every consistent formula is satisfiable. Now, if every satisfiable formula is consistent, once you have proved this, it means every satisfiable formula is satisfiable in a model of bounded size. So you've shown the bounded model property for the logic, which implies decidability. Because there are only so many models of that size, and we've already shown that. So a Turing machine can enumerate models of that size, enumerate the formulas, and check whether a model. We have already seen that checking truth in a model is something that's in fact efficient. So you can check this. Therefore, this satisfiability is recursive. And in fact, we'll also see that the complexity is also pretty reasonable. So how do you show that every consistent formula is satisfiable? Well, for modal logic, we did this canonical model construction where we could show that you start with formulas, you have maximal consistent sets, and you order them. But instead of maximal consistent sets, we work with what I call the small canonical model. That means maximal consistent sets of subformulas. You are given a formula which you want to show is consistent, right? One formula. The entire universe for you now is only subformulas of that formula, right? And now we can talk about subsets of sets of formulas. We did this during the Tableau construction, right? So we're going to do something very similar, but we're going to use the prove the completeness theorem also. So this really maximal consistent sets, but not arbitrary maximal consistent sets over the entire language, but maximal consistent subsets of subformulas. Okay, right? Because you can still talk about that's a finite set, but it's still the same definition, right? When do you say a set is consistent? If there is no contradiction derivative, right? How do you say it's maximal consistent? Means I can't add anything to it. If I add a formula to it, it'll become inconsistent, right? Which formula do I add? A subformula, right? Among the possible subsets, this is maximal with respect to inclusion. There is one catch though. The problem with working with subformulas is that you have to be very careful. Consider a formula such as box P. What does it say? Or diamond P. Diamond P will say there is a reachable state where P holds. But then it doesn't have any O formulas or subformulas at all, right? It doesn't have any successor formulas. Now, without them, how am I going to build a model using the successor, right? So if you remember our Tableau construction, we would take a node and say, there is a diamond beta, which in this particular case we'll call O beta, right? And then add a child with beta in it. There are K such requirements, you have K children, etc. But then that will need an O formula, right? But there is no O formula at all in the subformula. So you have to enrich your understanding of subformulas so that even if I'm talking about a path, one step is also added as a subformula. That's all there is to it. Not a big deal, but that's easy. And you can add such subformulas, and that's not expensive. Expensive in the sense of complexity. Is the idea clear? The last point that I said, right? So it suffices to look at only subformulas, but then you have to be a little bit, you have to tune your idea of subformula a little bit more. So you look at a subformula closure, and SF of alpha is defined to be the least set containing alpha and closed under as before. Now I've done a slight change here. Please look at this carefully. What is the first one? Normally you'll say if not beta is a subformula of alpha, then beta is a subformula of alpha. Clearly beta is a subformula of negation beta, but I have written it as if and only if. What does this mean? The moment you see beta as a subformula, you throw in not beta as well. Now, not beta is not a subformula of beta, right? But I am saying, for instance, if we saw in our example before, for instance, box P, right? Diamond not P is not a subformula of box P, but I'm saying throw it in, right? Close under negation. Close your subformulas under negation. That's why it's called subformula closure. So, and then what about, well, once you have not beta, that will say not beta, and then not beta. But then we can always equate, no? Treat not beta as the same as beta, so that it doesn't become infinite simply because you closed under negation. The rest of it is straightforward. If beta 1 and beta 2 are there, both are there, throw in both. If O dot beta is there, then beta is there. Because of negation, this also means if O beta is there, then beta is there. Here is the important difference. If box beta is a subformula, then throw in not only beta, which is what you will do, but in addition, look at what I am putting in. O dot box beta is also put in. Now, this looks funny, right? Okay, doesn't this make it infinite? You start with box beta. Now I'm throwing in O dot box beta. What will that do? Well, by this, it will throw back box beta, which is already there. It doesn't make it infinite. I hope you see this. In general, supposing I had said, if beta belongs to SF, right, throw in O beta or O dot beta into the closure. That will make it infinite, because O beta is not the same as O beta, O squared beta, which is not the same as O cubed beta, right? So one step, you can't blow it up. It will become infinite. You can't do that. But here, this is perfectly all right. And this is a trick. Please understand this is a trick. And the trick is actually very good and not problematic. Because what am I doing here? If box beta is there, I am throwing in O dot box beta. But then look at the closure condition. O dot box beta will give me box beta again, which is already there, right? So no new formula comes in. And it's not that after that I throw in one more O dot, right? So I'm not, the O depth of the formula I'm not increasing, but I am increasing the combined depth and multiplying it by 1, nothing more. And of course, the moment O dot box beta gets into the subformula by negation closure, O diamond beta will also get in. O diamond not beta will get in. O diamond beta will get in. That's okay, right? None of this blows up the thing. In fact, you can check that the number of subformulas set of SF alpha is linear in size of alpha, right? We have just blown it up by a constant factor, and it's not even polynomial, I mean quadratic, it's actually linear. So whatever we have been doing, that logic continues. Any question about this? Is it clear? So there are two modifications to our definition of subformulas. Remember, what did I say as a subformula? If you take formula alpha, You look in the tree representation of alpha, any subtree sitting there is a subformula. That is the most natural definition. Of course, we have that. But in addition, along with subformulas, I am taking negation closure as well, right? So I am saying you take any tree, look at that formula representing that subtree, that one goes in, as well as its negation, right? Put a knot. That's exactly what's going on. So you're multiplying everything by 2. And then in addition, I'm saying the moment you see a box, you also say after next step box, right? So throw that in. And that's, you know, if there are k such subformulas, you are actually adding another such k formulas extra, right? So overall, it's a linear increasing. That's all. Any questions? Okay. And now we have the notion of down closed sets. If you remember, A is said to be down closed. So by the way, we do this, yeah, I've written it also. If not beta belongs to A, then beta doesn't belong to A. If beta 1 and beta 2 both belong, if the conjunction belongs to A, then both the formulas must be in A. If the disjunction is in A, one of them is in A. If box beta is in A, and this is why we have actually made it a subformula, then beta is there. And we remember box beta implies O dot box beta is as an axiom. So we can actually put it in. And if diamond beta is there, then either beta is there, or after there is a next step, there is a successor after which diamond beta holds. This is what we put in. And I should have written it on top. We assume that alpha is in negation normal form. That means what? Negations are pushed inside until they operate only on atomic propositions. So what is the syntax that we are thinking about? Propositions, negations of propositions, disjunction, conjunction, O and O dot, box and diamond, all of them, right? So, because you can always push negations inside. And that's very convenient, you know, to build any kind of down closed sets. Exactly like we did before for modal logic. I'm just following that same idea. And let D alpha denote the set of all down closed subsets of SF alpha. So these are the sets that we are going to build our model with. Yeah, is it clear? This is the notion of Hintikka sets or down closed sets that we talked about earlier. So earlier we built a tableau as a tree, now we build a tableau as a graph. What's the tableau graph for the formula alpha? It's a set of all down closed subsets ordered by the relation. This is exactly the canonical model relation we have been working with all along, right? Remember we said if box alpha belongs to A, then alpha belongs to B. Now it's not box, but it is O dot, right? That is the successor relation, right? Because this says every successor must satisfy beta, therefore beta must get into B, right? So whenever O dot beta belongs to A, beta belongs to B. That is this exactly the relationship. And if O dot beta is a subformula of alpha, then so is beta. So this is okay, right? So it makes sense to talk about these. And this is the relation and this is the graph. Once you have this graph, we are in business. Note that whenever box beta belong, in addition, even I have put in only O dot, right? The relationship is given only by O dot. But now look at what happens when box beta belongs to A. If box beta belongs to A, by down closure, O dot box beta belongs to A. By this condition, box beta will belong to B. By down closure on B, beta belongs to B. And this is exactly what we want, right? Because the graph, the edge relation of the graph uses the one-step modality. But now, right, when I go from A to B, if A says box beta, that means in all reachable states, beta must hold. Then after I take one step and go to B, right, this is a reachable state, so beta holds. But in addition, now everything reachable from B also must have box beta, right? So this is indeed the correct coherence condition. And we know that box beta holds in the model at the world A if and only if, you know, beta holds here, and after one step again, box beta holds in the every one step. So this is exactly what. Is the point clear? That's how we have set it up. After all, remember our definition of down closed sets actually said this. If box beta belongs to A, then O dot box beta belongs to A. Therefore, when I strip O dot and take to the B, box beta will actually get into B. Yeah. So this is a way of ensuring that reachability works correctly, even though my graph is defined for one step. Now we have some more work to do. Let U be any subset of the vertices in my graph. Now that gives you an induced subgraph, right? And I'll say this induced subgraph is a good subgraph if it satisfies certain conditions. What is that? First, somewhere in U, there must be some node which has alpha in it, right? This is exactly the Tableau condition, right? Tableau condition said at the root alpha holds, but now I don't know where it is. It's going to be one of them. And now, so the box part, O dot part is taken care of. I need to look at requirements. It says, take any A. If it says O beta, that means what? There is a next state where beta holds. Then there must be a B within U, right? Within the induced subgraph, I must be able to take an edge, right? And beta belongs to B. Remember, this is a condition we need, right? My graph has witnesses. If the moment I say O beta, there must be some successor which has beta in it. Similarly, take any A. If it says diamond beta, there must be a B within U such that there is a path, right? This is entirely within U, right? Within the induced subgraph such that beta belongs to B. Yeah. So basically what we are saying is that induced subgraph is good enough for me to build a model. To build a model, what are the things that I have to look at? Well, if O dot alpha is there, I want to make sure every successor has alpha. That is taken care of here. This is O beta is there. That's a requirement. Then there exists a successor. Okay. If box beta is there, all reachable ones have beta, and that is taken care of here. And this says if diamond beta is there, then there is a node reachable within U such that beta belongs to B. Yeah. So this is the, in fact, I should really write there is a path within U from A to B such that beta belongs to B, right? So this is the idea of, that's the meaning of diamond beta, right? So this induced subgraph is what we are looking for. The definition clear? So what do you do for the Tableau? You are given the formula alpha. You don't know whether it's satisfiable or not. Build this graph, right? Now, within this graph that you have built, right? Now, what is the size of the graph in general? This is the set of all down closed subsets, right? Of alpha. Down closed subsets of the subformulas of alpha. Number of subformulas is linear, but you're looking at that, let's say that is M, right? Now you're looking at all possible down closed subsets. So in general, you can have 2 power m nodes, right? So the number of vertices in the graph is exponential in the size of alpha. This is the graph that we are looking at. Within that, I'm saying I pull out a subset of nodes and look at the induced subgraph, and I call that subset, that subgraph is a good subgraph if there is a place where alpha holds, and everywhere, wherever I need to, I have said there is a successor, I can find a successor. Whenever I say there is a reachable node that satisfies alpha, I find a path to that node which has alpha. Okay, this is it. And once you have this, it's very straightforward to show that from a good subgraph, I have a model. Now it's easy to see that the existence of a good subgraph attests to the satisfiability of alpha. What do I need to do? I have to make it a model. For that, I define a valuation, and the valuation is exactly what you would expect. V alpha of A, right, is simply A intersection P. Right? What is the valuation? I mean, you already have formula sitting there, right? So which propositions are true? Well, A will tell you, right? It's a down closed one. It can't have P as well as negation P, right? So if it has, then put it in. If it doesn't have anything, make it false. That's what it says. We can now show that for all beta, which is a subformula of alpha, and for all A, which is in U, which is in your good subgraph, if beta belongs to A, then in the model that we have just defined, at A, beta holds. And this is a proof. The proof goes exactly the way we did this for modal logic. How will it go? Well, you do this by induction on beta. Remember, this is a one-way proof. It's not an if and only proof, and that's okay. Because remember, beta is in negation normal form, right? So what is the base case? If it's of the form P or negation P. If P belongs to A, then by definition of V alpha, P is true in A. If not P belongs to A, by down closure, P doesn't belong to A, right? Then we know that in the model, P is not true because P is not in A. So the valuation doesn't make it true. So it's right. Therefore, not P is true in the model. Done. If beta 1 and beta 2 belongs to A, by down closure, both of them belong to A. But by induction hypothesis, the model satisfies both of them. Therefore, it satisfies the conjunction. This is exactly what we do. Similarly, now, if O dot beta belongs to A, well, take any successor. But by definition of the graph, beta will belong to the successor, right? In that successor, by induction hypothesis, therefore, beta holds. So in all successors, beta holds. So O dot beta is true in the model. Right? If O beta belongs to A, well, by condition in the good subgraph, we know there is a successor that satisfies beta. Well, by induction hypothesis, beta is true in that model. So there is a successor satisfying beta, so O beta is true in the model. So you just keep doing this, right? This is exactly the semantics. And just observe that this condition takes care of the box form, this condition takes care of the diamond form. So once you have a good subgraph, right, the entire graph takes care of the box properties, and the selection that you got from the good subgraph will tell you that when you need a successor, you've got it. When you need something reachable, you've got it. And that's it. Completely. And of course, we know that by condition 1, there is some A naught which has alpha belongs to A naught. And by this condition, therefore, at that A naught alpha holds, and hence alpha is satisfied. So anytime you can find a good subgraph, then you know that alpha is satisfied. So this is really your decision procedure. You start with alpha, construct this graph for alpha, and you're searching for a good subgraph, right? And if you find a good subgraph, now this is the point. In exponential time, of course, you can guess the subgraph and check whether it's good or not. Okay? So it's easy non-deterministic exponential time procedure, but in fact, you can do it in deterministic exponential time as well, because you take all the down closed sets and remove things that violate these conditions, right? Basically, you take any node, right, which has a diamond beta, but then there are no successors with beta in the graph. Remove that node. Take any node which has got diamond alpha, and you find that there is no reachable one. That remember that this is a humongous graph, but we are talking about exponential time, right? So when you're talking about some, finding all the reachable sets, right, is linear in the size of the graph. So you are now talking about something 2 power m times 2 power m. That's 2 power 2m, right? It's still order singly exponential. So in deterministic exponential time, you can do this whole business, check for the existence of a good subgraph. So any questions? So even though I have not yet talked about the other part, every consistent formula we have to show has a model. How will we show? If alpha is consistent, then we'll show that G alpha has a good subgraph. That's all we need to do, right? I'll do that now. But you see already that the decision procedure The deterministic exponential time procedure is in fact in front of us. Okay, so what is the completeness proof now? Let alpha be a consistent formula. We show that G alpha has a good subgraph. Well, as I said, we take the set of maximal consistent subsets of SF alpha. These are called atoms. Let at alpha denote all of these. And now clearly every atom is a downclosed subset as well, right? It's a maximal consistent set, right? If beta 1 and beta 2 is there in it, both beta 1 and beta 2 will belong. If beta 1 or beta 2 is there in it, one of them will belong, right? So these are all properties of maximal consistent sets. So the downclosure conditions are all true. So it suffices for us to show that the subgraph induced by at alpha, in fact, is good, right? So this is my point, and that's straightforward, and that's what we'll do. And of course, there are some tricky details involved, but at least what we need to do is very clear. The at alpha is a set of subsets of downclosed alpha. So this subset gives an induced subgraph, and the claim is that's a good subgraph. So that tells you that you're done. Now, what is the first condition? We have to show that there is an atom that contains alpha, but that's straightforward again, because alpha is a consistent formula. It can be extended to a maximal consistent subset, right? Every consistent set can be extended to a maximal consistent set in here. So therefore, there is an atom such that alpha is there in it. So that condition is straightforward. Now take any atom and suppose O beta belongs to A. We need to show there is a successor, right? That means there is an atom B such that there's an edge to B and alpha and whatever beta belongs to B. How do you do this? It's exactly the proof in standard model logic, right? Take the set of all beta such that O dot beta belongs to A. Let's say call it gamma. Take the set of all gamma such that O dot gamma belongs to A, and then union beta. Argue that this set is consistent, right? Remember that we did this proof in model. This is a consistent set. It's a consistent set of subformulas of alpha. So it can be extended to a maximal consistent set. Call it B. Beta belongs to B. Its relation is there. You're done. How do you prove it's consistent? Use the K, axioms, exactly like whatever we did before. So this condition is also straightforward. So to show that it's a good subgraph, there's only one condition left. What is that? Let A be an atom and diamond beta belongs to A. We need to find an atom B reachable from A such that beta belongs to B. Reachable via atoms, right? Among maximal consistent sets. This is the third condition that we need to prove. So if we prove this one condition, that in every atom, if diamond beta belongs to A, then there is a path through atoms taking you to beta, we are done. And this is the heart of the proof. Now, this is where we need new techniques, because all the techniques we have got so far, how do they fulfill requirements? By adding an edge. But now I need a path. And somehow along the path, I have to maintain consistency. And that's not easy, because your logic may say OP. Let's say O dot P. That means after every step, P holds. Then O dot squared P. That means what? After every 2 steps, P holds. O dot cubed P. That means after every 3 steps. And then I can say diamond not P. And that's a problem, right? So how do I make sure that I can build paths? Well, let A be an atom and diamond beta belongs to A. By downclosure, either beta belongs to A, or after one step, there is a next step after which diamond beta belongs to A, right? This is the meaning of diamond beta. What does it say? There is a beta that is reachable. That means either it holds now, or there is a successor from where it's reachable, right? Now, in the former case, we are done, right? Because you wanted to say diamond beta belongs to A. There is one that's reachable reflexively, and we are done. In the latter case, let B be a successor, right? Such that diamond beta belongs to B. I should have put such that here. Because we know that, right? If O something is there, then there is a successor. Again, if beta belongs to B, we are done. Otherwise, we have some B belonging to C, but we are not making progress. We have returned exactly to the same step, right? Do you understand the problem? Ananya, you see what's going on? Diamond beta is there in A. It's not satisfied right there. So I go to, there is a successor. I go to that. It's not satisfied there. There is a successor. I can keep going like this, right? Maybe I will get into a loop. I know I can't go on infinitely far because there are only finitely many atoms, but maybe I'll be stuck in a loop. That's okay, right? I'll go from A to B, B to A, or large cycle. We must prove that this is not possible. We need to show that such indefinite postponement is actually inconsistent. And that's really what we have the induction rule for. We have not used the induction rule. We use the induction rule to show that this is not going to happen. That you can't keep on saying diamond beta and never actually see beta, right? You get the point? This is the heart of the proof. And this is what transitive closure is about. And this is really where, you're doing second order kind of reasoning. It's not first order anymore. Now, and this is where the usefulness of the small model, the atoms, really comes in, right? Because we are working with finite subsets of alpha. And so therefore we can take these subsets and denote them by formulas. How do you turn a set into a formula? Take conjunction, because these are finite sets, right? And then use those formulas in proofs. This is the heart of the matter, and this is the essence of the Cosen-Parikh technique, okay? So take an atom A, let A hat denote a conjunction of formulas in A. This makes sense because A is finite. It's clear, right? This and looks like conjunction, that's why we use this. Similarly, now we have a subset of atoms, right? I can turn that into a formula by saying, let's say X is A1, A2, right? How do I say I am in one of them? I say A1 hat or A2 hat. Right? Take the disjunction of A over X and take the characteristic formula A hat. Do you understand this now? So basically, I can take that finite graph and take regions of the graph and turn it into formulas. The nodes can be turned into formulas, regions can be turned into formulas, and then you can use the inference system. It's a very neat idea. Now, suppose alpha belongs to A, right? Remember, what is A? A is an atom, and alpha is sitting inside it. But A hat is the conjunction of all formulas in A. Therefore, alpha is one of the conjuncts, right? A hat is of the form gamma and alpha and delta, right? So of course it implies alpha. So whenever alpha belongs to A, I can represent in formulas by writing A hat implies alpha. Now similarly, if X is a subset and A is a member of the subset, A hat implies X tilde. Why? Remember, X is A1 or A1, A2, A3. So now A1 implies A1 or A2 or A3. Okay? A2 implies A1 or A2 or A3. So the atom implies the disjunction of those atoms in this set. Okay, and this is the most beautiful statement here. What does this say? If you take the set of all atoms and take the disjunction, that's a theorem. Now, this is not an easy thing to prove. I mean, it's an easy thing to prove once you get the idea. Why is that? Now, take a formula P, atomic proposition P. What are the atoms for P? There are only two subformulas, P, not P. Both are maximal consistent, right? And P or not P is in fact a theorem. Suppose you have two propositions, P, Q. For propositional logic, if you do this, you will see immediately. Suppose you have got PQ. What are all the atoms? One is PQ, another will have P negation Q, another will have not P or Q, another will have not P, not Q. Well, take the disjunction of all of them, and that's a tautology, right? And this is true and this is simply because you have got propositional logic. Because the idea of maximal consistent sets is propositional, and that's all there is to it, right? So this is a theorem, but there's got very interesting consequence. Now, if you consider two sets X and Y that partition the set of atoms, what does that mean? I take the set of all atoms, and so X and Y are disjunction is I mean, their intersection is empty and their union is active. That means if I take the disjunction of formulas in X, that will give you that's equivalent to not of Y tilde. Because if you are in X, you are not in Y, right? And if you're not in Y, you must be in X. Right? So I can turn this into a formula, right? So I can talk about a particular subset of atoms. I can look at the set of all atoms. I can talk about partition of atoms. So basically, navigating things in the graph can all be turned into form. Okay. Now let diamond beta belong to A. Now let H denote the set of all atoms reachable from A in this induced subgraph of atoms. We don't know what it is, some H, right? Now, suppose there exists B belonging to H, such that beta belongs to B. Then we are done. Why? Because H is all the reachable ones, and B is an atom that's reachable, and it has got beta sitting inside it, and we are done. Remember, this is what we need to prove. If diamond beta belongs to A, I need to prove that there is an atom B that is reachable from A, and beta belongs to B. So we are done. So suppose otherwise. What does the otherwise mean? We are saying for all B in H, beta is not there in B. But this is a maximal consistent set. Therefore, not beta will belong to B. And that's a formula as well. So what does this mean? Well, for all of them, negation beta holds. So that means if I take H tilde, that implies negation beta. Why? But this is the OR over all those elements in H. Each of them says not B. So the entire disjunction gives you not B. Now I can generalize, right? Box of this is a theorem, and then you push box inside using the K axiom. I get box H tilde implies box not beta. Right? This is what is very nice because now I'm simply doing symbol manipulation, right? I mean, I'm just doing symbol pushing, right? And that's fine. Now I claim something very interesting. Remember, H is the set of all reachable ones, right? The claim is that if you are in the region H, then after every successor, you continue to be in the region H. And that's reasonable because I started with A. What is H? H is all the reachable nodes. Now, if I'm talking about being within the reachable nodes, when I take one step, no matter what step I take, I continue to be among the reachable nodes. We'll prove this claim later, but assume the claim for the moment now. Now, by induction rule, remember alpha implies O dot alpha. If that's a theorem, then alpha implies box alpha as a theorem, right? That's exactly what the induction rule is. So H tilde implies box H tilde as a theorem. But then, remember box H tilde implies box not beta. We have proved that. Put these two together, I get H tilde implies box not beta. But then A is an H. So you know that A hat implies H tilde. Putting these two together, I get A hat implies box not beta, which is a contradiction because I started with diamond beta belongs to A. And A is consistent. So, I mean, diamond beta belongs to A, therefore A hat implies diamond beta. And this says A hat implies box not beta. So I get both gamma as well as negation gamma, which contradicts the consistency of A. That's it. So the moment I prove this claim, I'm done. Is it clear? This is a tricky argument, but once you get this idea that all I am doing is to code up the graph into formulas, it falls into place. Now I need to prove that the claim is true. Well, suppose not. If A implies B is false, right? A implies B is not derivable. That means what? A and negation of B is consistent, right? Well, what is negation of B? Here, O of not H tilde, right? This is exactly H tilde and O of not H tilde is consistent. Well, now consider whatever is the complement of H. H is a set of atoms. Take the complement. The complement is K, right? So what do we remember? Not H tilde is the same as K tilde. If two sets partition H and K, we have already seen that one is equivalent to the negation of the other. So we have H tilde and OK tilde is consistent. But this is a disjunction, this is a disjunction. Right? Some disjunct and conjunction over some disjunct. Right? So that means there is some B here and there is some C here, such that B hat and OC hat is consistent. Right? Because this is a giant disjunction, this is a giant disjunction. One of them, right? A or B and C is consistent is the same as A and C is consistent or B and C is consistent. One of them is consistent. Keep applying this repeatedly, you will get B hat and OC hat for some B and C. But now we see that if B hat and OC hat is consistent, what do I know? Suppose O dot beta belongs to B. Now O dot beta and OC hat is consistent. O dot and O will give you O. Right? So beta and C hat is consistent. That means beta, but C is a maximal consistent set, right? So beta belongs to C. So that means that this BC is actually in the relation OR alpha. If whenever this holds, if O dot beta belongs to B, then beta belongs to C. That's our edge relation. But then C is reachable from A as well, because remember B is reachable from A. That's what it means. B belongs to H means what? It's reachable from A. Therefore, C is also reachable from A. That means C belongs to H. But that's a contradiction because we said C belongs to the complement. Right? And that's it. Tricky argument, but very neat. And I consider this one of the really beautiful proofs. Okay, so that ends the completeness proof. And okay, so if you just give me 5 minutes, I will just wrap it up with some things on what this transcript closure logic is about. Actually, the logic was not developed the way I presented it as a transcript closure logic. This was defined as the propositional dynamic logic of regular programs. And the idea is this. Well, you know regular expressions, that's why it's called regular programs. Take a finite alphabet and look at a set of all regular expressions over sigma. And you don't have these two modalities O and diamond. What you do is you take propositional logic and then throw in a modality diamond pi alpha, where pi is any regular expression, right? And so it says what? You are at a state W, diamond pi alpha holds means what? There is a path that is in the language of pi, right? Which leads you to alpha. Box pi alpha will say, no matter what path you take in the language of pi, alpha will be true. And that's it. And now, but then it's easy to see that technically it's exactly the same logic that we had, because the following are valid. Pi 1 plus pi 2. What is regular expressions? You have plus, you have choice, you have one followed by the other, sequential composition, and then iteration. But diamond pi 1 plus pi 2 alpha is the same as diamond pi 1 alpha or diamond pi 2. Because in regular expressions, this is simply the union. Union is just disjunction. And pi 1 followed by pi 2 is the same as saying you do pi 1 and then pi 2 alpha. So this is already there in the logic. What you don't have is clean iteration. Diamond pi star alpha, which says either alpha holds now or after one execution of pi, diamond pi star alpha. But this is exactly what we saw with O and diamond. So that's why. And the induction rule, which was alpha implies O dot alpha, from that alpha implies box alpha, is similarly here alpha implies box pi alpha, from that you can infer this. This is really the PDL logic of PDL, and I assure you, all the technical questions for PDL are answered exactly the way I presented today. So it's basically the logic of transcript closure, except that now you can actually enrich it with regular expressions, take the paths using and reason about paths. It's quite a very nice logic. And Pratt really defined dynamic logic, not for regular programs, but to talk about any class of programs. Because I can write formulas like this. Alpha implies diamond pi true and box pi beta. What does it say? It says when you start the program in a state where alpha holds, the program pi terminates. Diamond pi true means what? There is a way of doing pi after which true holds. That means it terminates. And then the post-condition beta holds, right? So you can actually reason about input-output behavior of programs and their structure, their composition, all of these things. And if we go beyond regular programs, I mean, instead of regular expressions, if you take, context-free programs or some other programs, PDL becomes undecidable, but still provides a very useful logic of programs. What is very interesting is that you can add operators that preserve regularity, right? Regular languages are closed under intersection. So you can put in pi1 intersection pi2. You can put in shuffle, concurrent shuffle, synchronized shuffle, a whole lot of things. And they will be decidable because you know that, this is only regular programs, but complexity is affected drastically. For instance, PDL we said is decidable in deterministic exponential time. The moment you add intersection, it becomes non-elementary. Non-elementary means not just exponential time, not just 2 power 2 power n, but 2 power 2 power 2 power. The height is unbounded. And so a lot of very interesting things are there in PDL. And PDL is the logic of programs in some sense. And once you understand PDL, you can understand pretty much any kind, technical machinery for PDL, all logics of programs become accessible to you. There's a very nice book by Harel in the IMSC library, a big tome called Dynamic Logic, really, shows you various dynamic logics. And then when we combine PDL with other modalities like epistemic logic, you get really rich theories of programs. In fact, you can talk about distributed programs, concurrent programs. There is a whole wealth of material out there. But then PDL is reasoning about programs. Who wants to reason about programs? Only programmers want to reason about programs, right? I mean, who cares? Somebody who's using a system would really like to know properties of the system that is programmed, right? You don't care about the programming itself, right? Who cares about it has loops and it has, right? You would like to look at their input, output, or reactive behavior in the sense that reactive in the sense of stimulus response, right? If the environment offers this, how does the system react? That's all. You don't care about its loops and its branching structure, etc. So you'd like to reason about the space of computations of the program, not the program itself, which means what? You take the model, you are interested in the infinite tree unfolding of the model, and you want to reason about parts in it or the branching structure of the tree itself. And this is what leads us to so-called temporal logics, which are linear time temporal logics if you want to look at only parts, or branching time temporal logics if you're also interested in the branching behavior of these. And so PDL in some sense is the logic that you begin with. I would say it gives you entry into understanding temporal logics, but temporal logics are really the logics of computation that, not logics of programs, but logics of computations that people are interested in. And that, is a very, very rich theory. Again, there are books in our IMSC library on temporal logics, several books, in fact. And, there is a whole wealth of machinery. And it's also very closely tied to automata theory. And perhaps the most important application of automata theory in the last 30 years has been in area of verification, where now temporal logics are industry standard. And, but that's a topic in itself, and I'm not talking about it. But as far as the basic logic machinery is concerned, once you understand transitive closure, and that's why that proof that we did was a bit of a tricky proof. But once you understand that, you are really in business to looking at logics of computations. Okay. That's it. And so that last bit was a bit fast, but I will send you the PDF. You can look at it and digest the proof. I'll also send you some lecture notes on these things so that you can look at these things in some detail. Okay. Any questions? Okay, then. So then we'll meet on Thursday, and Thursday will be the last one. I want to look back at first order logic and modal logic, all these things in one thing, and also look at decidability issues, which we have looked at here and there, but look at borderline between decidability and undecidability and questions of this kind. And so that will be and also several open questions that come out of these. So that'll be a way to wrap up the course. Okay. Yeah. So